the next question topic is number 3, which is the command to rule and death before the fall. Again, this is controversial. A common teaching of young earth creationists is that death was only present in the universe after Adam's sin. So there was no death of any kind before the fall of man. Ben, you have talked about the presence of death before the fall explicitly contained the command to subdue and rule given to humanity. Could you spend that? Could you spend on that? I mean,
absolutely.
Because you done videos about this, so I know you can spend on this.
So the passage in Genesis 1, I'll go ahead and read it off real quick.
Mm-hmm.
God blessed the man and the woman, and he said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves upon the ground." So about a year ago, I went into the James P. Boyce Library at where I did my undergrad, and I found every single academic commentary on Genesis I could and read it on this passage. And because I wanted to, the primary view of most scholars is that the biblical authors contradict each other on the subject of animal death before the fall. So you have some passages that seem to refer to, of course, there was animal death before the fall. Animal death is like a natural good part of God's creation. And then you have certain passages where creationists and scholars in general, a long tradition in Jewish scholarship, has interpreted the Bible as containing the idea that animal death was never originally part of God's original creation, that it was never good. So my whole view of this passage changed when I ran into a doctoral thesis written by a scholar named Joshua J. Van E. And Van E is spelled V-A-N and then double E.
Mm-hmm.
So this passage in Genesis 1:28, God tells the man and woman to subdue the earth and rule over the animals. If you look up these two words in Hebrew, subdue and rule, which we've all heard sermons where it talks about when God says this to the man and woman, that he's telling them that they need to take stewardship over the earth and care for the animals and care for the earth. And it's used to support environmentalism, those types of meanings. But the reality is, if you look up these verses, these two words within Hebrew, every single time they occur, they're quite harsh, actually. So the word kavash occurs a full total of 13 times in the Bible outside of this passage. And in every single instance, it refers to enslavement or violent conquest. It also has an Akkadian cognate, which means the same things. So to give you a summary of every time it's used in the Bible, 6 times it's used of war conquest, 5 times it's used for enslavement. Micah uses it once for trampling underfoot, and then Esther uses it once for as a locution for sexual assault.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had this other word. So you have the word subdue, and then you have the word to rule. The word for rulership occurs 26 times, this particular word. And in every single instance, I didn't believe any when I read this, so I went and I did the work myself. I looked up every single instance in the passage, and I'm telling you, like, absolutely, the term is used for a severe coercion. So I've created a summary of every single instance. I know people are going to be skeptical of my claim here, so I'll go ahead and read it off real quick. Leviticus uses the word for rule, or the Hebrew word rada, 3 times of ruling with severity. That's the quote, ruling with severity in that passage. Then once more it's used of being ruled by, quote, those who hate you. Numbers 24 uses it of a ruler who, quote, destroys survivors. Judges uses it of a military campaign against Canaan. And a modified form is used of Samson forcing or what has been translated as scraping honey out of a lion carcass.
Which that has to do with, I mean, a military campaign. Unless you are so nice, you're not going to kill anybody.
Whenever these two words, rule and subdue, are used together in the Bible, it's always in reference to the Israelites being told to go conquer Canaan.
Yes.
Let's see. Kings and Chronicles uses the term of vassals that are forced to pay tribute and what are explicitly specified as Solomon's enslaved enemies. Nehemiah uses it as a locution for the oppression of one's being ruled by, quote, one's enemies. And it talks about how they cry out to be delivered from that oppression. Psalm 49 uses it of trampling the wicked. Psalm
Trampling the
68.
wicked is killing them. It's killing them.
Psalm 68 refers to the rulership of Benjamin's military conquest. Psalm 72 of Israel making her enemies, quote, bow down and lick the dust.
Yeah.
We're getting there. Psalm 110 of the king, quote, making his enemies a footstool. Isaiah 14 of Israel, quote, possessing and, quote, enslaving its enemies. Verse speaks of ruling with, quote, unceasing anger. Isaiah 41 speaks of, quote, subduing kings, thereby, quote, turning the nations to dust by the sword. So again, they're all pretty harsh so far. You have Jeremiah 5. It refers to ruling, the, quote, horrible and, quote, shocking rule of Israel's priests over God's people. Lamentations 1:13 speaks of God, quote, overpowering the lamenter by hurling down fire on him, quote, in fierce anger. And then you have two references in Ezekiel 29 and Ezekiel chapter 34. The first refers to God's judgment of the great monster of Egypt. That's the quote, is great monster in the passage. And then you have Ezekiel 34, verse 4, which refers of ruling, quote, harshly and brutally. So I've gone through every single passage here, which is something I hadn't done before in the past publicly.
Thank you.
when I say that these passages subdue and rule, like they're pretty harsh. They're military terms. They refer to military conquest, to essentially fighting and subduing the enemy.
Which has to do which in any military campaign has to do with killing.
That only makes sense if God's creation mandate in Genesis 1 is assuming that the animals had the potential to be hostile combatants, that there's a struggle with them that's going on. It's not like when you go to the Creation Museum in
I was gonna say that.
where you've got Adam. He's like side hugging a penguin, and he's petting like a leopard with his other hand, and there's a T-Rex in the room and that type of thing. That's not what's reflected here.
Subdued means that they were still feral.
Exactly. Let's see.
Because that's how God made them. I mean, it's a good part of creation. That's why God commands us to like the cat. We have to toilet train the cat, because we have to subdue him. And I didn't do it brutally, but I have to subdue the cat. So that's
and in reality, like when you go back and you read the passage, it talks about you need to subdue. What is it? I'll read it here. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky. Like, how do you rule over fish and birds exactly? Unless you're killing them, unless you're eating the fish, unless you're eating the birds, which is what people in the ancient Near East did quite regularly. Let's see. One thing that's really helpful about Van Ee's discovery here is the fact that if you look at Genesis 3, the curses, like seriously, read it very, very closely, the curses that are placed on creation in response to Adam's sin. There's never any hint whatsoever about this idea that animals now are going to die, that this is going to be a new thing, that they'll die. There's no hint that there'll be predation introduced, which is interesting because God cares about telling them about, hey, thorns are going to grow now. But, animals that, wolves that eat your lambs and your livestock, like there's no mention of that whatsoever.
They're never warned about
so it's
that.
just totally unexplained by the traditional interpretation. So I guess if your listeners are astute at all, they're probably thinking of all sorts of other passages that are cited to hold up this belief in an originally vegetarian, like harm-free creation. So I know Isaiah, for example, he talks about the lion will eat straw like an ox, and it'll lay down with the lamb when God returns in the new creation. You have passages, especially in Paul, where he talks about all creation groans
Yes, Romans 8.
from death, and what is it? Romans 5. Adam through sin introduced death into the world. I won't go over all of those now. I intend to do that in a future video, one of my next ones. But Van E, he's published a paper in the Journal of Biblical Literature you can find online, which talks about the Isaiah passages, which it's absolutely like his interpretation of those passages is absolutely astonishing, like extremely, extremely powerful. Now that we know this about ancient Israelite religion, that they didn't believe in this original notion of animal death, of animal peace, I mean. When it comes to the passages in Paul, the research that I've invested into those passages shows that if you just go read them, it's actually kind of funny. Like, they're pretty obviously and explicitly directed at human beings, not at animals. That when Adam when in Romans 5, when Adam brings death into the world, for example, the passages directly specifying human beings. That it's the whole point of the ancient Near Eastern creation account is that you have the tree of life, and Adam and Eve, they had contingent immortality, and once they sinned, they lost access to that, and that's how death spreads to all of humanity.
The tree of life.
What those passages don't care about, what they don't talk about, what Paul is not talking about when he's talking to the church is animals in those passages.
Which is interesting. I mean, Paul is very selective what he wants to say to the churches. Sometimes I think that it's because Paul knows that they're not. I mean, the churches that he's writing to are mainly in Turkey, today Turkey, and a bit western from Turkey, and they don't usually hold the same ancient Near Eastern myth cosmology as he did, or as he was aware. I mean, and Paul was Turkish. Was Turkish as well. So
yeah. So there's a lot of Greek influence.
Yes.
But, I actually just, since I'm not a New Testament guy so much as an Old Testament guy, I threw my interpretation at a Mark Seifert, who's a Pauline scholar.
Yes.
Or no, it wasn't Mark Seifert. George Carraway. He's a Pauline scholar at a.
Sorry, no?
I can't remember which theological seminary, but he told me just point blank, yeah, I think you're correct. He doesn't care about animals in these passages.
It's like the rapture. He doesn't care about babies.
This is something that happens, which I think you're probably familiar with, is like there's all these verses that we have memorized, like John 3:16, that sort of thing, where we invest loads and loads and loads of theology into them. But if you go read them in their original context, like, we almost treat them like magical, like this amuletic function linguistically, where they represent all these concepts, but in their original context, like, they're actually quite specified, quite narrow in what they're communicating.
So 3:16. So John 3:16 is neither Calvinistic or Arminian.
I'm not going to go there with you.
Yeah, well, it doesn't matter because they didn't exist at the time. When people want to talk to me about it, I said that's an anachronistic discussion. They don't care. Yes. John didn't care. So why? So and people get desperate with me because I said, if he didn't care, I don't care. So yeah, but you have to answer what? Just to satisfy your thirst for gossip or something. Okay, that's good.